right, so tonight I'm going to do something that's a little different. We've done it a few times before, always had good luck with it, but we're going to do a kind of a panel discussion, not a debate, just a discussion, and we're going to do it about Brigham Young. To help me with that, I've brought on some big heavy hitters, right? We've got Kimberly Watson Smith, Jacob Vidrine, we've got Sean Anderson and Taylor Smith that are all joining us here for this podcast. And so as we have this discussion, just know in advance, these are folks who have done their homework. They understand the gospel really well. And we all come from a little bit different perspective on Brigham Young. Certainly, some of us have had our differences in the past, and that's okay because we're going to have those things. But I think I wanted this to showcase that even though we have our differences on certain things, on these big important issues, we can come together and kind of have each other's back. I mean, I'm a fundamentalist. Sean's a fundamentalist. Jacob and Taylor are both fundamentalists. Kimberly is an active member of the LDS Church. And we can all kind of come together on this and really kind of back up Brigham Young here. Because I think you'll see by the end of this podcast just how vital he is to the restoration going forward. So with that, I think everybody knows who everybody is, right? I mean, we've all worked together, talked together at some point. So I don't think there's much need for an introduction. But I'm just going to be tossing out some questions, and then as you guys have thoughts and ideas or whatnot, feel free to jump in. We'll keep it orderly, but by no means is this a raise your hand to participate sort of a thing. So with that, let's just dive right in. I want to throw this question first out to the panel, and I want to get everybody's feedback here. So we're living in a day and age today where Brigham is under immense attack. People would be happy just to chop Brigham off and not have him be part of the gospel story at all. First, I want to ask this question. Why do you think that is? Who wants to take a first stab at that?
I actually just had somebody ask me about this today because there's just so many railing accusations that are made against Brigham Young. And this friend of mine was asking, he said, these people with a diverse set of views that they don't really even agree on. The only thing they really agree on, it seems, is attacking Brigham Young. And so he was wondering why all these different people with different beliefs about authority, different breakoffs, different modern movements that have come forth. And I kind of, what came to mind when this was just asked me a few hours ago, I said, well, I think Brigham Young, he was the most successful in perpetuating what Joseph Smith was teaching and restoring out of anyone else. And he got the biggest following. And so he's by far the biggest target for people who are disgruntled or looking for someone to attack or demonize or tear down in the restoration. I think that's probably the biggest reason, in my opinion, is that he has the biggest target on his back for being the most successful and having the most followers. If that out of all the Nauvoo breakoffs and in Mormon, and when you get into the succession crisis and all that. So I don't know, does anyone else have any thoughts? Or
yeah, one of the observations that I can make is he's often charged, and those who follow him, where they refer to us as Brighamites, they like to claim that the victors write the history. And the thing that makes me laugh at that is the fact that Brigham and the saints that had to leave Nauvoo and leave their homes behind at that time didn't seem like they were very victorious. As a matter of fact, they're the ones that were run out. And the fact that given the time that's passed, even in his day, the church continued to grow. They continued to build the kingdom of God. They established it, and they still had the same goal. And if you look at those that stayed behind, they just kind of fell back and became another Protestant movement, in my opinion. And I think in some ways there's a certain amount of, I'll go ahead and call it jealousy. But anyway, that's just an observation I have about that.
Taylor, did you want to take a stab at that at all?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. So, the reality is that there are some difficult doctrines in the Restoration, and they're not for everyone. And one of the things that seems to elicit the most emotional and just major response of anything is polygamy. And so we have this situation today where the church has disavowed polygamy for 135 years or 4 years, give or take. And a lot of members of the church are not familiar with the history. But if they start to have concerns with maybe the church's authority and legitimacy, then they look for any weakness, any area of weakness, and getting people upset about polygamy or anti-polygamy, that's something that politicians have been doing since day one in this country. So I mean, you look at even in the 1860s, I want to say it was the Stephen Douglas debates. I guess it would have been the 1850s. Lincoln and Douglas were asked about the Mormons, and Stephen Douglas said, "Well, I'm gonna, it's like a cancer. I'm gonna cut it out with a knife, and get rid of the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy." And so polygamy is a very easy thing to bash. And you have a lot of people who are, I guess you could say, they want to believe in some parts of the gospel, like Joseph Smith and seership, Book of Mormon, some of these very positive and frankly don't require quite as much of a sacrifice types of principles. And if they can find a way and find a way to do it and not have to touch anything that's distasteful or that would challenge their propensities and things that they would be interested in, if they could get rid of polygamy and keep Joseph Smith, I think there's a huge market for that. And so that has, especially with recent movements like Denver Snufferism and the Doctrine of Christ group with Justin Griffin and so forth, I think that there is a probably sincere desire to cling to the gospel, but they don't realize that they are absolutely destroying it because of their disavowal and trying to remove polygamy from the equation. That's I guess maybe another. And if you can discredit Brigham Young, that is the ultimate ad hominem. Because they like to pretend that it was just a conspiracy by the 12 to take over things and institute polygamy for, probably carnal reasons and whatnot, which is just silly. But it is a very prevalent thinking that I've encountered in discussions with various folks in different groups.
Oops, sorry. Kim, do you have a take on this at all?
I maybe have a unique perspective. I'm sure maybe you've considered this, but just being a mainstream member of the church, I would say that because I have in the church as a whole, I think there is a very negative view of Brigham Young, even among the faithful. And the reason why I feel this way is because, number one, I feel like we're so far removed from the doctrines today that most people just didn't grow up with, like what Taylor was saying, kind of those hard, the mysteries of the gospel. They weren't passed down from one generation to the next. We've kind of just dismissed them. And so I think as far as just, we're living also in a generation where we're, this is fifth wave feminism now, right? And I think the more people are a victim of feminism than they realize. And so reading Brigham Young is very hard for them. It goes contrary to culture, to everything they've grown up with. And I mean, you go tell someone to read Brigham Young, and do they even understand what he's saying? It goes against, everything they've been conditioned to believe for even about the Restoration. People talk about Joseph Smith, but how many people even really know his teachings? I mean, let alone Brigham Young. But when Brigham Young's teaching the teachings of Joseph Smith, that's what they're dismissing ultimately, is what Joseph Smith revealed.
That's awesome. I want to probe this a little bit. Because quite frankly, I'll be honest, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone out there in the audience. This isn't something I put together. How does feminism kind of make someone more prone, I guess, if I'm understanding your premise here a little bit, Kim? How does feminism make someone feel maybe more at odds, or put someone in a position where they might be more at odds with Brigham Young? And the other thing I'll say is I was not aware that we're into the fifth wave of feminism. I stopped. We were still back on the fourth. So,
right. Well, think about it. Brigham Young, nobody even, if you were to ask someone, what is the patriarchal order? What kind of response are you going to get? It would be that you're going to hear whatever, the feminist view is. It's patriarchy. It's bad. It's male domination.
Toxic masculinity.
Yeah, toxic masculinity. I mean, you just have to look at, even in today, people can't even wrap their minds around even a marriage where you have a man and a woman that's 50-50. Even to them, that is, that tramples on the rights of the women, even if they're in an equal partnership. She has to be completely free, independent of a man. And I've actually seen this in just recent, LDS podcasts where, women are talking about, oh, we want, the priesthood, or we want to, there's this priestesshood that we need to be seeking after. And they don't realize that is part of the patriarchal order. They don't even know what it is. So, and that I believe it's because of feminism. And even if a woman says she's not a feminist, she carries ideas. Both men and women today, I believe, carry those ideas, and they look at it through that lens, the gospel through that lens.
wow, that's some profound stuff. That's awesome. I think there's a book by Hugh Nibley called Brother Brigham Challenges the Saints, right? And I think that Brigham constantly challenges us, right? He has to. He's a prophet. That's what his calling is, to a large extent, is to challenge us in terms of living the gospel more fully, but also the things he taught. Let me ask this question, and then we'll move on to something else. Many things, almost all things that Brigham teaches, you can find Joseph teaching as well. Why doesn't Joseph get the same pushback as Brigham Young? And that's for the whole panel. Whoever wants to take a stab at that, all of you, if you'd like.
Yeah,
Taylor.
I'll dive into that first, because that's some excellent perspective, Kimberly. The reality is, even the saint, it's not just modern saints that struggle with Brigham. Even some of the early saints really struggled with some of the things that he was teaching, even when he said, I'm just teaching what Joseph taught me. And so the reality is, I can't remember if it was Jacob or Sean, somebody mentioned earlier about the deeper things. I think maybe all of us may have touched on it, but some of those deeper things are when Joseph, the nature of being a martyr is that kind of you get a pass. You get kind of, your memory is unsullied, as it were, from anything that could have, and so people just have a tendency to paint with rose-colored glasses some of the things that Joseph did, and the reality is he did teach some very challenging things to the saints, but he did it in private. And Brigham, kind of, when the church relocated to Utah, they were outside of the direct threat of mob violence and government oppression back east in the United States. And when they established kind of an autonomous nation of Deseret, there was certainly a little more freedom people, I think Brigham and others felt that they could speak a little more freely. And so it's not that Joseph didn't teach things, but he didn't teach them publicly. And so even the contemporaries of Brigham Young struggled with a lot of the deeper, more challenging things that Brigham Young kind of brought out in public. So
No, that's good. Sean.
Yeah, what I wanted to point out is to follow along with what Taylor was saying. One of the biggest claims from that group of people is that they actually say there's no evidence contemporary with Joseph Smith that he taught any of these doctrines. And actually there is, and I found that anytime you find anything, they look for a way to invalidate it by calling into question the credibility of whoever wrote it down. And it doesn't matter that people testified of these things from different camps. You have people that were inimical to Brigham, friendly to Joseph. You had people that were inimical to both, all saying the same thing. And yet they like to paint it as a conspiracy from Brigham Young directing everything. And to me, he's got to be the best conspirator ever, because he gets all these people from different camps to agree on the same thing. And it doesn't matter to them that the lens from which those people are looking at it. Those that are against it are definitely critical about it, but they point to the same facts. And then you have others that are amicable to those principles, also relating the same facts from that perspective. So to me, that goes well beyond the law of witnesses to establish a truth, especially when you have people that are not in no way able to to conspire with each other because they're in opposite camps.
So one of the things I would add, why I think people think why it appears that it seems baffling to us, but why it seems to be easy for some people to try to blame everything they don't like on Brigham Young and make Joseph Smith in their own image, is the reality is we don't have really good records for everything in Joseph Smith's lifetime. And, there was no Pittman shorthand records of Joseph Smith's sermons. You have brief summary notes that different people kept at different times. And by the very end of his life, you start to get some more detailed shorthand reports in 1844. But even those are not anything compared to the detailed stenographic reports we have of Brigham Young's sermons. And so not only it's not as well recorded, but you also have over twice the amount of time of Brigham Young teaching throughout his ministry and having recorded teaching. So like with Joseph Smith's ministry, we have 1830 to 1844, 14 years really. With Brigham Young, you have over 30 years. He was is he the second longest serving president of the church behind Heber J. Grant, if I'm not mistaken. So he, had a lot of years, and he was very open about his views. He was on the rough frontier, and he was very abrasive in his language and how he talked. And he often would admit that he said things that were harsh or more callous, that in order to get the saints, in order for what he's trying to convey to the saints to get through to him. And he would say that often he would use harsh language and not actually mean what he said. But people, especially when it comes to the feminism issue, because I do think that's a big issue behind attacking Brigham Young, is, there's obviously the culture that he's in, but you can cherry pick when you have that 30 years of stenographic reports of what he's saying at various times. You can cherry pick that to almost create whatever Brigham Young you want. You can take the harshest statements to make him out to be a monster. You can take the nicest statements and make him out to be, a fuzzy unicorn. But the truth is somewhere in the middle. But he definitely but I think that you need to not just judge him by his words, but by his actions. And so with the feminist attack on him, they really want to take something out of context. And I saw this happen actually just today with a post that was made, trying to take something he said and use it to say that he was trying to silence women, telling them to just shut up and accept polygamy, when that is not the context of what he was trying to convey. He was basically saying that it's not good to have a grumbling spirit. And if you are, he basically said, I'm willing to let everyone who is unhappy with this system leave the territory and, have your bill of divorce, have your property, and be taken care of. If and this is your opportunity. But if you choose to continue to live this way, you cannot have this eternal grumbling about it. And so that kind of actually, and so some people point out in response to that attack that it contradicts the narrative of this idea that women are being pressured or forced or imprisoned into polygamy, because he was, or into Mormonism in general in the Rocky Mountain West, this idea that he was oppressing people and forcing them into the system. Brigham didn't want to pressure everyone into Mormonism. If you were disgruntled and you weren't giving your heart to it, he wanted you gone. He said, I want apostates to clear out. And he wanted people to not be having their influence poison the rest of the saints. And so, and so some people will take some things he says about, he says in certain discourses to try to malign his character. But when you look at his actual record and how women were treated in early Utah, his record of allowing women to very easily get out of bad marriage situations, if they are in bad marriage situations, compared to the rest of the country at that time, and the empowerment of the women with the Relief Society and with the political participation that he encouraged during his lifetime, I think there's a much more complicated picture than what the simplistic demonizing image some people try to create. So
good stuff. Kim, did you want to take a shot at that too?
I just want to push back a little bit about even the idea that there were a lot of people that even in early Utah that didn't like Brigham Young. I'm sure that's the case. I don't run into a lot of that when I study church history, and I just want to speak to the women, because I actually gained my testimony of Brigham Young by reading some of the women and what they had to say about Brigham Young. And for example, Eliza Snow, she's written many poems in praise of Brigham Young. And it's not just her. There's a story of Emily Partridge, who we know, I think is it Emily that was a poor wife? She's Joseph Smith's poor wife, and then she married Brigham Young. And she tells this story of how she needed to go to Brigham Young because she needed money, and she was kind of intimidated by him and didn't know quite how to approach him. And then she relates the experience, how she had a completely opposite experience of what she was told was, how he was going to be overbearing, and she was afraid to approach him, and he turned out to be, loving and kind. And so it's not just it's not just the poor wives. There's many women who said, I entered into poor marriage because Brigham Young had the voice of an angel. And when he spoke of this command, I knew it came straight from God. And so I could list hundreds of sources where you have women testifying of how to them Brigham Young was a prophet. Brigham Young was a leader. He was loving and kind, and those that actually followed his counsel, you'll see that those are the women that actually had the gifts of the Spirit. Those are the ones that he trusted to go out and give healing blessings to the other women. And these are the women that he trusted to go and build the first hospital. I don't know if people realize that Brigham Young, he organized a group of women to build the first hospital in Deseret, and it was Eliza Snow in charge, and she had just women. And so the way it's just mind-blowing to me how we look at women and how they want all of these rights. And then when you read the women in early Utah, they had all of those rights and more under Brigham Young.
Absolutely. And he also, if I'm not mistaken, actually sent women back east to be trained as doctors, right? it not just, you're in charge of the hospital, but felt like women should be doctors, right? Especially, for delivering babies, that sort of thing. So there's a lot that Brigham doesn't get credit for. The other Brigham quote that I love is they were talking about he was given a lecture and or a talk, and I believe it was at the Tabernacle, and the subject of disciplining children came up. Now, this is a guy who lives in the 1800s. Sparing the rod and spoiling the child are very much on the forefront of everybody's, lexicon as far as raising kids. Brigham says something fascinating. He says, I've found that the use of the rod on our children too often is the result of a spoiled parent more than a spoiled child. Try reasoning with your children, right? This is a guy who's not necessarily even fitting in his time in a lot of ways, and a little bit forward thinking. I have a slightly different opinion on why people are targeting Brigham over Joseph, and that is because you can't really, and this is because I think that these actors are a little more nefarious, to be honest with you, and a little more disingenuous than just being willfully ignorant. I think they know they can't discredit Joseph and keep the gospel, period. I do think they have either subconsciously or a very real thought that if they can unhook from Brigham, then they can take that gospel that Joseph restored and kind of twist it into whatever they want. Brigham is a linchpin within the gospel, and his place has to be secure if we want any of those blessings that we as Mormons, albeit a mainstream LDS person or a fundamentalist, have come to hold dear, right? This idea of eternal families, of sealings, these sorts of things. It all hinges with Brigham after Joseph's death. And if you can get rid of that, you can really remake the gospel into anything you want. So, is anybody else got anything they want to add to that before I move on here? Perfect.
I just want to know what.
Okay. Let's let Kimberly go, and then Jacob, then you.
It's really a quick thought. I just want to know what teachings of Joseph Smith we'd have if Brigham Young didn't preserve them.
Amen. That's the biggest thing, is that the whole reason we have the records of the church, the history of the church, the sermons, is Brigham Young and the apostles. Willard Richard is the church historian, absolutely preserved them. And so, yeah, I've seen the same quotes you've seen, Dave, about Brigham Young on raising children. And I was actually surprised when reading the Journal of Discourses, I ran into those quotes. And, it goes against my sensibilities personally, but he definitely cultivated some very different ideas from the time that he was in regarding child rearing. And one quote that I really liked that he said in several different quotes that it's important to cultivate your children to be free thinking and independent. And he said, never check a child for questioning, cultivate that principle. And that he said it's important for them to get their own character and to get their own independent moral character and able to get revelation for themselves. And so I think that is one of the best things, in my opinion, that contradicts the view of Brigham as the tyrant, besides the fact that he's constantly telling the saints to get revelation for themselves and that they aren't supposed to blindly follow him, and that everyone needs to be independent and to not follow your leaders if they're teaching you bad things. But, his instructions on teaching the importance of children gaining that independence. So.
Perfect. Thanks. Sean, you had something?
Yeah, maybe one of you can check me because I'm just going off of memory. And I read this about 20 years ago, so bear with me on that. I remember a quote by Brigham Young where he says, "Has a master spirit ever arisen in a family where no one can go to the left or the right of the straight and narrow path?" He says, "Nay, a master spirit would seek to leave such an environment." He says, "Nobody wants to see virtuous young men and women more than I do." But he says, but in doing so, we should never kill their passion. We should guide it, we should instruct it, but not kill their passion. of these wild young men that we see roaming the streets of Salt Lake City, you'll see some of the greatest men that ever lived in Israel. Something to that effect.
All right. So with that, I want to kind of turn to some life events here, because I think there's some things that set Brigham up. And I want to just throw these out and talk about these just a little bit. So he's born in Vermont. He is, by all accounts, very destitute growing up. His mother dies when he's like 14, and he goes almost straight to work as a carpenter. From there, he kind of, does his thing. He's a carpenter. There's really, I haven't discovered a lot about like his dealings with other people, but in this instant, I kind of think no news is good news. You know what I mean? He doesn't seem to be exceptionally remarkable in any way. He joins the church in 1832. And then just shortly after that, his wife dies. And then he ends up marrying again, and then is like a captain on Zion's camp. So I want to talk about those years where he was either a Mormon or just became a Mormon a little bit. How do you feel that these life events, his mother dying, he has to go to work really early, gets married, his wife dies. How do you think that impacts who Brigham Young is as he's coming into his own within the gospel? Anybody?
Well, I can't speak from personal experience. My life is pretty cushy compared to that. But we know from various other people that have had to deal with those types of challenges and trials in their lives that it's unquantifiable. Like it is just impossible to really comprehend just how challenging that can be to somebody's growth and development. And so, the reality is we all have heavenly parents. Our earthly parents are so important to the plan of Father in heaven, but like these stories like Brigham Young and some of the other pioneer stories that I can't remember any names just off the top of my head, but people that had to go through those types of challenges and endure such great losses personally in their families, and who were able to kind of prevail over them. Like that is not normal. That to me, that shows a great measure of divine providence and heavenly help to be able to survive those types of things without like becoming a criminal or without becoming just jaded beyond beyond everything. And so like those, to me, yes, those are terrible tragedies, but it can't take anything away. If anything, that actually increases the amazing achievements that he accomplished in his life. So
absolutely. Jacob, Sean, Kimberly, you guys got anything you want to add to that?
Well,
Kim, go ahead.
Sean, go ahead first.
I was just going to say that experiences like that usually have a tendency to either make or break you. We always experiences like that have a tendency to put a fork in the road for you. And one is to basically curse God and die. And the other one is to actually rely on God even more. And what I can see, the principles of the gospel, especially when we talk about eternal sealings and the eternity of family relationships. An experience like that, I think, could galvanize somebody like Brigham Young to be even more committed to the principles that would bring that about. Because to reject Brigham Young and the way he preserved these, especially these types of teachings, is to basically put the axe to the root of the hope we have in eternal families. And there are many that are critical of Brigham Young that are also taking the position that temple work is invalid. And with people that have experienced this type of traumatic loss, that's a great hope for them. To know that not only will they see their loved ones again, but they will be able to have relationships with them throughout the eternities by the virtue of the sealings that take place. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that.
Kimberly, what'd you have to say there on that?
Well, definitely along those same lines, is I think that for sure, I see when you study the early life of Brigham Young, you really see the Lord trying to shape and mold him to become the servant that God needed him to be. And I don't know if you're going to touch on this. I was going to brush up on this story before, and I didn't have time. But there's an account in the life of Heber C. Kimball, I think it was. If I'm getting it right. Where what happened? What does anyone know the experience that Brigham Young had the day that Joseph Smith got the plates?
No, why don't you go ahead and fill us in?
I mean, I'm just hoping if someone else heard the story, they could fill in the details. That the night that Joseph Smith got the plates, that there was this miraculous event in the heavens, and I believe it was Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young. They went out and they basically saw a battle in the sky. And so they knew that, something was going to take place. Something significant was taking place at that time. And I think that was just a prophesying of who Brigham Young was and his place, is his role in this great, last days battle. If anyone can fill in the details, please do so. It's been a while.
I've seen a lot of I've seen a lot of sources for that. They share that throughout their lives, that story of that vision. So they didn't know what was significant happening at the time, but they later realized that it was the same night that Joseph was retrieving the golden plates. So
yeah, I can kind of speak to this one personally a little bit. My old man passed when I was 13. Now, my old man, he was a great dad. In a lot of ways, he kind of reminded me, once I joined the Church of Brigham Young, he could definitely be gruff. He could definitely be in your face a little bit, but he also had a tremendous passionate side, a compassionate side, excuse me. And the old man was really good at making money, but he was horrible at paying taxes. And so when my old man passes, he's got a couple of businesses, and those just go away because, there's back taxes that are owed. And that left us pretty poor as a family. And so I remember at the age of not quite 14, probably 15, I honestly start working, not out of, hey, I want money to go goof off with my friends, but I've got to buy my own clothes. I got to help out my siblings. I was the oldest of those. And so there was a sense of growing up fast. And Kimberly used a good word, which was molding, right? I look back on those times now, and while they were certainly tough, they were very formative in who I would become. And there is this idea of molding or forging a person through adversity, right? And I think this sets him up for such a thing, right? He gets tough. He begins to understand how important work is from the very beginning. All these things start to play a part in who Brigham would become. The other event I wanted to touch on was, it's just shortly after his baptism, him and his wife's baptism, that his wife just dies. She passes away of consumption, which, if I'm not mistaken, someone can correct me here if I'm wrong, I think that was cancer, what they called cancer in the old days, right? Consumption. Or does anyone else know? Anyway, I could be wrong on that. So a doctor out there listening can correct me. But I think it was like a pretty nasty disease to watch someone die from. It would have been real easy to throw in the towel at that point if you're Brigham Young, right? It would have been way easy to be mad at God, but he doesn't. Instead, he doubles down inside the gospel. And I think in some ways, if the death of his father or his mother, excuse me, is something that hardens him, I think this event might kind of soften him back up, right? One of the shows that I absolutely love, and it's a guilty pleasure, there's a show called Forged in Fire where it shows them making knives and that sort of thing. And a blade has to be strong enough to take some abuse, but still soft enough that it's not brittle. And I think we can see this in people's lives, and I think we see this with Brigham Young, is that he's tough enough to get the job done, but not so tough that he becomes dispassionate, that he can't relate to people. And so I see these formative events as Brigham's forging process, where the Lord is making him into more than he would otherwise be. And I think we have to recognize that. The other reason I think it's important to look at Brigham's formative years is because by the time all of us know Brigham Young, we've kind of turned him into a marble statue, so to speak, right? He seems to be a legend and just larger than life, and we sometimes forget about his humanity. And I think that has to be brought out here. I want to ask this question here. With Brigham Young, he goes through these processes. What is it you think Joseph sees in Brigham Young? Because there's a very real sense that Brigham comes along and Joseph kind of gravitates to him from the very beginning. In your guys' opinion, what is it that Joseph sees in Brigham that attracts him to Brigham? Jacob, you want to take a stab at that one?
So there's the saying that's repeated, that's several different sources all recall this, that when Joseph saw Brigham for the first time, he said, there's one of the greatest men that will live to preach redemption to the inhabitants of the earth, and he will yet lead this church. So a prediction that Brigham Young would someday be a leader of the church. And after meeting him for the first time, I think there was this zeal that Brigham Young had for the gospel. He was excited to be in the restored church, and he said, I wasn't even in. He said, and he was very humble about it too. He said, I got baptized, and he goes and ordains me an elder, and he's like, I didn't feel qualified to be an elder at that time. I just, but I was grateful, and I felt it was a responsibility but he meets Joseph, and they're doing family prayer together when meets the first time he meets Joseph Smith. And Brigham is actually the first person in this dispensation to have the gift of tongues, in that in saying the prayer, he starts having the Spirit come upon him, and he starts speaking in the Adamic language. And some people thought that might be, is that right? That's not, that's not normal. But Joseph said, no, that's the gift of the Spirit. That's the gift of tongues that is mentioned in the scriptures. So Brigham had spiritual gifts throughout his life. And, and I do think that Joseph saw him in him the capacity to be a great leader and a great missionary for building up the church and kingdom of God.
Taylor?
So I have that quote. I'm just going to read it because I think it's great. Upon seeing, so this is from the diary of Charles L. Walker, page 134. It's dated September 1832. And he says, upon seeing Brigham Young for the first time, and while yet some distance away, the prophet Joseph stopped his chopping on a beech log, straightened up, studied Brigham for a moment, and then remarked, there comes the greatest man who ever lived to teach the identity of God to the world, and he will yet lead this people. Now, the provenance of this prophecy has been called into question by some people, but I've looked at the original just on the church archives, and I mean, maybe it was written in afterward, but it is dated to this time, and so it shows that not only was there a personal connection, but I think that there was a spiritual, like, to say that he was, basically had never met the man, but just sees him coming from a distance and can say that prophecy. That's pretty amazing. So, I think that Joseph Smith had a lot of enemies during his lifetime. And so the other thing I would just point out is there were only two, I want to say, so the Quorum of 12 was organized a couple of times during Joseph Smith's lifetime. Once was like at the very beginning, 18, when was Oliver Cowdery giving the apostolic charge, Jacob? It's probably about 1832, 33, somewhere around there. That
35.
35. Okay. So the first Quorum of 12 was organized in 1835. And of that original number, I want to say all but two apostatized. And some of them came back, I believe, but the two that never faltered, I guess, were Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. And so I think Joseph, he had been betrayed and, disappointed by so many people throughout the course of his ministry, that he just valued Brigham Young's steady influence in his life, and just appreciated his loyalty. So I guess that's what I would add to that.
Perfect. Kim, you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and most people don't know this story. Well, you guys might, but it's interesting when you study 1835, when Joseph Smith chooses the 12 apostles. They actually ordains Brigham Young first, and he actually does it in private. And he relates, and so he anoints him first. First of all, he anoints him, and then he ordains him to be the 12. And then he goes and then he chooses the 12 and acts like this is the first time Brigham Young's being chosen, but it wasn't. And Joseph Smith writes in his journal that he had a vision of Brigham Young in the celestial kingdom, and he sees him, and I'm assuming this is like, last days during Zion, where Brigham Young is out gathering the elect, and he sees the Savior, on his right hand side as he's preaching the gospel, and people are trying to kill him.
Wow. Jacob, I got a question for you. What kind of events are you aware of that Brigham had? Because really the next the next major event we have in Brigham Young's life is he's sent on a mission to England. Are you aware of anything that goes on during that mission that is especially of note or anything like that?
Well, I do think that's an important aspect to Brigham Young. He actually served missions before that. He actually talks about that, how he was always striving to be willing to go without purse or script in the summers to be preaching the gospel. And he said that when he met Joseph Smith, and he said after he met him in 1833, Joseph Smith kind of gave them the counsel to never again build up a Gentile city. And he said that Joseph told them to gather and to build up Zion was the big instruction. And Brigham took that to heart. And so he moved to Kirtland back when Kirtland was, very, it wasn't, it didn't have thousands of people yet. It was still, relatively, it was just barely starting. And he said, and you got to remember when Brigham Young's wife died shortly after his baptism, he's left with two young children that he's having to take care of. And he said that his friendship with the Kimballs, that the late Kimball was actually very helpful to being able to help take care of his children when he's working or when he's on serving missions. So he goes to Kirtland, and he basically doesn't really have any prospects at the time. And it's, they're all poor. And he basically said, I went anyway. And he said there was a brother Cahoon there, and he basically said, I'll work for you, and so that I can be doing something to help build up Zion. And Brother Cahoon said, I'm just, to be frank with you, honest, I don't even have money to pay you. So, but Brigham says, I don't care. I'm willing to work with you. And if you will just share what you have with me, then then we'll, if we're unsuccessful together, we'll be unsuccessful together. If we're successful together, we'll be successful together. And so that's kind of his zeal that he had for the gospel. And so, but I agree with you. The mission to England after the Kirtland Temple is built and they receive the endowment of power and the Spirit in the Kirtland Temple, that the next big thing is Joseph telling the preparing them to go and gather Israel across the ocean in England. And that had to take a ton of faith to do that. And the thing that I think is significant about the mission to England is that there were 9 members of so out of the 12 apostles that were the 12 at Joseph's death, 9 of them had served successfully in the England mission. And there were 3 other apostles at Joseph's death who weren't involved with it. William Smith, Lyman White, and the third one, Johnny Page.
Oh, Johnny Page.
George. So all the other ones, they were willing to take that big leap of faith of, taking that treacherous journey, sailing in a boat across the ocean in that day is not an easy, light task to do. And you often got seasick. It was, and I think that's recorded in their journals. So actually, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball were both, I think, very ill when they were set off for their mission. They were willing to take the leap of faith and set off anyway. But anyhow, so 9 of the 12 that were the apostles under Joseph and Nauvoo, they went and they served their missions in England. And that really united that quorum. And they never really divided again after that. They had their doctrinal spats, their difficulties every once in a while, but they stayed a united body after that, while the other 3 who weren't involved with, that sacrifice and that leap of faith and that mission, they went in totally different directions. And so I think that mission was very important as a leadership opportunity for Brigham Young learning. I think it was Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and Willard Richards who acted as a presidency over the England mission. And so they had that was almost like a precursor to them later becoming a new first presidency after Joseph's death. But I think one thing that's significant with the England mission, one fascinating story that Heber C. Kimball shares is that they saw this vision of all these evil spirits in England, and that's a significant story that they share throughout their lives in their sermons. And Heber C. Kimball said he shared that with Joseph after returning to Nauvoo, and that Joseph said that the more you're trying to the closer we approach the Lord, the more the adversary is going to be trying to attack us. And so that was a significant thing. And then I guess just to briefly summarize, there were other principles that were made known to the apostles in vision in England. And it's one thing the polygamy deniers will try to say is they started doing polygamy in England, which isn't true. There's not evidence to substantiate that, even though they tried to pretend there is. But they did get a revelation that Brigham Young said that was a precursor to Joseph explaining polygamy to him in Nauvoo, that he had the promptings of certain things from the Spirit that he did not then understand. But then when he returned to Nauvoo, that Joseph was able to teach him polygamy, and that he was receptive because he had that experience. But that isn't the only principle that was revealed in England to Brigham Young. The principle of baptism for the dead was actually the event that sparked Joseph Smith getting the revelation on baptism for the dead. Was a convert in England actually got a vision of seeing the apostles and priesthood holders preaching to spirits in the spirit world, and doing baptisms for the spirits in the spirit world. And the word of that vision spreads like a wildfire throughout the church. And it gets back to Joseph Smith, and Joseph says that it's true that there is preaching in the spirit world. He said the one thing he disagreed with was them doing baptism in the spirit world. He said that that's an ordinance that has to be done in the flesh. But he said the vision was expressing the importance of baptism and trying to prepare for the revelation of baptism for the dead. And so that's how Joseph Smith got the revelation of baptism for the dead. And so the apostles said they first got learned about baptism from the dead while they were still in England. And they said another principle that was revealed to them in England is, as man is, God once was; as God is, man may become. That was another revelation that the apostles, that Brigham Young said that he received in England, and he shared it with Lorenzo Snow. And sure enough, they get back to Nauvoo, and Joseph Smith starts teaching them the higher principles about God, which they were prepared for because of those experiences in England. So, yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything else to share on the England mission, because that's an area of church history that I personally have not studied a whole lot on, but I think it's an important period for Brigham Young.
Kimberly, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Mm-mm. That
You
was
know
really
what?
well.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, and I think this is one of those areas where I think we need to look real close, because I think it's as him and Heber, if I'm not mistaken, are getting ready to go to England. They're very ill, and so is their family, right? Um, and I think this is the instance where they're like riding out on the cart, and one looks to the other and says, "It's a hard thing we're doing." And they have this idea that they'll just get up and give kind of a religious exuberant display, and basically three shouts for Zion kind of a thing is what they do. My question,
Hurrah for Israel.
thank you, that's it. Yeah, see, and that's why Jacob's way better than me, because he's got that off the top of his head.
There's a painting of it that I love, and so that's how I remember what they said.
Okay, all right, nice. So yeah, I mean, in those days, it's not like you could say, well, I'm just going on a trip and you just got a cold, right? That cold could kill you, right? People were dying of things that we consider kind of minor today. And so Brigham's going to head out and he's going to do this despite him not doing well, right? I mean, from the account, they're very, very ill. And their families are very, very ill. I look at that and I'm like, I'm a wuss, right? I mean, if I got a case of the sniffles, I'm like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to church today. I think I'm going to stay home and pack it in. These guys are like straight up gangster, right? Like, oh no, burn the boats. We're going, we're gone. And just have success while there. What do you think it is that truly separates guys like that from, say, people who are lukewarm? What is it about Brigham's desires that are different from say everybody else? And then how do we cultivate that? Sean, any ideas?
Yeah.
Okay, give me
Well, one thing I'd like to say about that is it's very easy to speak in platitudes throughout your life. But when actually put to the test, many people fold under those circumstances. I remember in 8th grade, I moved up from Mexico and started attending 8th grade in Bisbee, Arizona. And it was kind of a rough town. But there was this boy there that was mercilessly to say the word being picked on is an understatement. I mean, being picked on is being teased, being shoved around or whatever, but he was literally being punched and hit, not just by one person, but by several. And this was going on. It went on for about 2 weeks. And I remember thinking to myself, why won't anybody do anything about it? This happened around the teacher. And when this kid tried to say, this is happening to me and all that, it just basically got ignored. And I saw this happening and I started feeling really bad, because I have to admit I was afraid to stand up, because I was a pipsqueak, and in that grade, I was one of the smallest guys in the class. And but it got to the point where I just felt like I couldn't stand to see that anymore. And they started in on him one time, and I just got a surge of courage. I walked up and I shoved a couple of guys away and said, "Leave this guy alone. What's wrong with you people?" And I knew in doing that, I was going to make myself the new target. And that's what I was afraid of. And that worked. They left him alone, and they started in on me. The difference between me and this kid is that my dad had been a boxer in his youth, and he taught us how to box from the time we were very little kids. Put the gloves on me when I was 4 years old. And living in Mexico the way I did, we got in a lot of fights. So I had experience in doing it. And within a month's time, I got in about 3 fights. 2 were small skirmishes where a few blows were thrown. Nobody really got hurt. People broke it up. But the third one was against the guy that was the biggest guy. He was almost a whole head taller than me. And he was actually pretty, at least from my perspective at the time, he was pretty scary. But I fought him and I didn't back down. And to my amazement, I actually won the fight and won it convincingly. And well, nobody picked on me anymore. But the good thing is that they quit picking on this kid. And so that kind of had a happy ending, but I didn't know that going into it. And in situations like that, I think most of us can have moments in our lives where we're put to the test that way to see if we have integrity, to see if we have valiancy. My dad used to say to me, "Son, it's easy to be honest when you have the means to pay everybody back. But the true test of your integrity or your honesty comes when you don't have the way to do it, or it's very hard to, and you do it anyway." And so that has been, and I haven't always lived up to it, don't get me wrong, but I've had moments of weakness. And we say weakness a lot, but the reality is it's cowardice. You know, I really understand the words of the song in A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief, where it says, "He asked if I for him would die. He said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak," or the blood ran chill. "But the very spirit in me said, I will." And to me, that encapsulates how that I think we'll all be faced with that at some point. And what we should do is to nurture that type of courage in our life. So when the time comes, we can't stand for that which is right. And no statement is truer than to say that the only thing that evil needs to flourish is for good men to do nothing. And I believe that Brigham Young encapsulates that to a great degree. With all his faults or anything that he might have had, I believe he was a man of courage and a man of integrity and a man of honesty. And the more I read him, the more I see it. And it doesn't bother me that he was at times considered harsh. Because I have found in my life that the kind of men you can count on, and women, a lot of times tend to be a little rough on the side. Anyway.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Okay. The next place I want to go is to the secession crisis. Because I look, while certainly you can't say this is where Brigham's ministry starts is at the secession crisis, because he has those other experiences. He's a captain in Zion's camp. He is going on missions. He's Joseph's ardent supporter when everybody else ditches him. But this may be, at this point, Brigham Young's greatest test. And Jacob, this is one of the reasons I brought you on, is because you're so good with the history here. Talk to us what it's like when Brigham first receives the news. He's in Boston, if I'm not mistaken, or Massachusetts somewhere. And then he gets to Nauvoo. Talk a little bit about how he hears the news of the prophet's death, and then talk about what he finds when he gets to Nauvoo.
So I absolutely agree with what Sean said about Brigham's courage. And that's a big thing in the succession crisis, is that he really was the one who had the courage to stand up and to make a stand for Joseph's measures and Joseph's principles. But I do think we should probably circle back to the Brigham Young in Nauvoo as an important church leader.
Sure.
Right. But yeah, so in Nauvoo, Brigham actually, so when we talk about the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, we often just think that they're the de facto church leaders because that's how it's understood today, and that's how it's systematized since, after Brigham Young's death. But it wasn't actually formally laid out that way in 1835 or even 1844 for that matter. It was something, apostolic succession was something that developed over time. And I agree with what Taylor said, where Brigham Young, it was because of his loyalty to Joseph Smith that he gained Joseph Smith's confidence and was involved with more and more things and given more and more responsibility. There's a quote where Brigham Young said that when the apostles were first called in Kirtland, that Joseph, he said that the president of the quorum, I think it was McClellan, if I'm not mistaken, complained about how they were, not really treated with any real importance. And Brigham said, yeah, we were snubbed for power back then. He says it wasn't until we could prove ourselves that we were the servants of all that we would be trusted with authority to be, to given full authority over, church matters. And so, the apostles initially started off just as traveling missionaries, but then by the Nauvoo period, they had proven themselves. In England, in their mission, they had converted more. There were more saints in England converted than there were in the United States, or at least gathered in Nauvoo. So the church was actually larger in England than in the United States for a period of time. And so Brigham and the apostles get back to Nauvoo, and Joseph starts to really magnify them. And at the conference, I believe this is in August of 1841, he says, I want the 12 to, they've labored hard in the mission field for years and not entrusted their families in the hands of the church to provide for their families while they were gone. Now it's their time that they should be here in Zion and direct their work from here in Nauvoo and send, instructions abroad to other missionaries. And they should take time to provide for their families and stand next to the first presidency in the affairs of the church. I don't think that was necessarily appointing them as the successors at that time, but I do think it was magnifying their responsibilities in Nauvoo. And there's a number of things that Brigham Young was involved with in Nauvoo that I think is very significant. Like, obviously the temple ordinances are an important factor into why the apostles were the best choice for the succession crisis. So it was the endowment ceremony, the marriage sealings, anointings, work for the dead, all of that Joseph began to hint at in public discourses during the Nauvoo period, but it was in his private councils that he began to begin to confer these ordinances and teach about these ordinances and principles to his close followers. And so the first meeting of the body of men, that would include women, that would come to come to have I think 66 or slightly more than that members by Joseph Smith's death. There was a body of men called the Anointed Quorum or the Holy Order, where Joseph began to confer the temple ordinances, because he said that he had premonitions that he might die before the temple is completed, and so it's important to begin to initiate other men into these ordinances. And so Brigham Young is there that in that very first meeting on May 4th, 1842. You can find that in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 237. Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Willard Richards, three of the apostles, and the two bishops, Newell K. Whitney and George Miller, So obviously Joseph, Hiram Smith, I think, and then William Marks and William Law and George Adams or James Adams of Springfield are the 9 men with Joseph Smith who he revealed those ordinances to. And I think what's significant is that Brigham Young is involved with the endowments and the anointings and the ordinances from 1842 to 1843 to 1844. So he is actively involved with the temple work that's going on. He's getting to hear Joseph's instructions in his public sermons as well on what he was envisioning and what was important. And he was also involved with the Council of 50, which was organized in 1844. And so there were all these secret forms and developments that were going on and new doctrines that were being introduced to the saints. Like, I guess celestial marriage is important in that was revealed to the apostles when they returned from their mission in, I think, 1841. And then Joseph taught them plural marriage shortly after they returned from England. And so he's right at the center of all of these developments that Joseph Smith is revealing to the saints or is preparing for the saints. Like a lot of the secret stuff in the Anointed Quorum and Council of 50, that stuff the saints only heard rumors about and didn't have a whole lot of information on, but the public stuff as well. He was getting this instruction and he was absolutely right there in the center of all of Joseph Smith's activities of these new doctrines that Joseph was preparing for the saints and ordinances as well.
So when Brigham, for all intents and purposes, kind of seems to be becoming Joseph's right-hand man here through the whole thing. He goes back east, and that's when Joseph is assassinated, right? That's when the martyrdom takes place. When he comes back, right? Because it's not like the old days, I mean today, where you could just hop a flight and be back in 6 hours, right? It's a little bit of a process to get out. Jacob, what does he walk into when he gets back after the martyrdom? What do the conditions on the ground look like?
So, you mentioned the missions. And so I think what's another thing that's significant to Brigham's character is Joseph actually dictates a revelation in Nauvoo saying that Brigham had basically his calling elections made sure, that he had been faithful to that point and that the Lord was not going to require him to leave his family to serve missions anymore. But Brigham still wanted to do it anyway. He still felt that missionary desire. And so he was active in the summers in Nauvoo going on shorter missions. And so when Joseph is running for president so there's 2 different projects in 1844 that Joseph is really starting to emphasize. The first, that they need to have a gathering out west where they could live the laws of God as God has revealed it to them without anyone else interfering with them. And so that was the Rocky Mountain expedition was a big thing in 1844 that Joseph was starting. And the other thing was a presidential campaign because of the constant political persecution the saints had received and not being able to receive any redress from any government and not even the federal government. And none of the presidential candidates were willing to, be willing to give Joseph a satisfactory answer that they would help the Mormons in their plight for their rights. And so Brigham and the 12 actually were more than willing to go out and serve, these stump campaigns for Joseph Smith's candidacy for president in 1844. And Brigham's out west when that, back east, when that happens. And when they get the news in July that Joseph and Hiram were killed, Brigham's initial reaction is he said that he felt like his head was going to crack. He said, "I didn't cry, but I had never felt deeper sorrow in my life." And he said his initial thought was, "Are the keys of the kingdom taken from us?" And he said it came like a clap, and that he said Orson Pratt was sitting on his left, and he said it came to him that the keys of the kingdom are still here with the church. And he actually said he didn't think it was with him, but he knew it was the Lord's business. And so he had that comfort and that revelation that the keys were still on the earth and that they hadn't lost their authority with Joseph's death. So the apostles start to return to Nauvoo, and in Nauvoo, there's actually there's conspiracy going on in Nauvoo, and this is very significant in William Clayton's journals that I think that's kind of overlooked, is that Joseph had intended, if he were to die, for his brother Hiram or his brother Samuel to lead the church, and that's recorded in William Clayton's journal. But what's significant to me is that even before Samuel Smith is still alive, he doesn't die until the end of July. Emma is already trying to conspire to have William Marks be the next leader of the church shortly after, like a week after Joseph Smith's death. And I think the reason she's wanting William Marks to be the next person in charge is because she knows that William Marks is against polygamy, like she's against polygamy, and against the temple doctrines that Joseph is revealing. And so she's trying to get into this conspiracy with William Marks, and then Sidney Rigdon is there very quickly. And they're trying to form kind of a party to take over the church and to get rid of these Nauvoo doctrines that Joseph was restoring that were very controversial, in which William Law felt that Joseph, needed to be stopped for introducing it. So William Law conspired with the anti-Mormons to get Joseph Smith killed over these teachings. But then there's Emma and William Marks and Sidney Rigdon who want to get polygamy and temple ordinances and theocracy and all these doctrines out of the church. And so they're conspiring, and the apostle and basically they're wanting to do a meeting to reconvene to select a guardian for the church before the apostles get back. And this is the beginning of August, that after Samuel Smith's death, they are preparing to select Sidney Rigdon as the guardian, and they plan a meeting for August 8th, 1844, to appoint for Sidney Rigdon to advance his claims to be sustained as guardian of the church. And fortunately, the apostles that were away got back to Nauvoo 2 days earlier on August 6th, 1844. The apostles that were abroad were able to get back to Nauvoo. And the day before the August 8th meeting, on August 7th, there was kind of a precursor meeting where Sidney Rigdon starts to advance his vision, his claims. And Brigham says, his comments in response are very interesting and significant, in my opinion, where he says he didn't really care who ran the church. He said it could even be old Ann Lee, but we need to get revelation on it. And he said, I know who has the keys to get revelation. And he mentions the significance of, that the apostles and others had been given the fullness of the priesthood by Joseph Smith. And so that played a big factor in what was going on. And so he said, actually, on August 7th, 1844, I know there are those in our midst who will seek the lives of the 12 as they did the lives of Joseph and Hiram. We shall ordain others and give the fullness of the priesthood, so that if we are killed, the fullness of the priesthood may remain. And so that's one of the temple ordinances are a key factor in the apostles' succession claims. So on August 8th, 1844, and what's interesting is that we're on the anniversary of this date. They had the meeting, and Rigdon advanced his claims. And I think Brigham said that he only last minute heard about the Rigdon speech. And so he went and he was kind of last minute came to Rigdon's speech, while the other apostles weren't even aware. And so Rigdon advances his claims to be made guardian of the church. And when Brigham Young stood up after Sidney Rigdon spoke, and he started addressing the saints on how they needed to come together and have the priesthood meet together and to discuss this matter more thoroughly. Those saints who had oil in their lamps and who had the Spirit, there were many saints who had a miraculous experience of seeing Brigham Young transfigured to both look and sound like Joseph Smith. And that's one of the most well-attested miracles in church history, is the transfiguration of Brigham Young. There's well over 125, if not way more. Lynn Jorgensen has 129 sources she compiled of witnesses to the transfiguration of Brigham Young. but it showed those saints who were without a shepherd that Brigham Young was the one they could trust to carry out Joseph Smith's measures. And I think that was a big contributing factor to why the saints that afternoon, when they did the second meeting where they actually had all the priesthood convene, and Brigham Young got up and talked about the authority issues and running the church. I think that is why they almost unanimously accepted the 12 to lead the church and to, as a quorum, the quorum of the 12, to act as the first presidency and to carry out Joseph's measures as he had laid them out. And so yeah, I think that's very, a very significant event. And I think it's interesting. Today is actually the anniversary of that, August 8th, when we're of the transfiguration of Brigham Young starting. And so, yeah, I just think it's, it's a very important part of church history. So
Sure. Taylor, let me go to Kimberly and then we'll go to you.
Sorry, I had texted him and said I had something to add. So it's just been like, that impression. I just have to share this. So, I mean, that was the, really great explanation by Jacob. And before we move forward, I just kind of want to backtrack just a little bit. So what was one of Joseph Smith's greatest mission? What is the purpose of the Book of Mormon? It's the sign that what?
I think she's talking to you, Sean.
I'm just talking to anyone who will answer. What is the Book of Mormon?
I'm just kidding.
What did Joseph Smith say? It was the sign of what?
Wasn't it the gathering of Israel?
Yep, the gathering of Israel. And so it's significant that in, I believe it was 1841, Joseph Smith issues the proclamation to gather. And because of the labors of Brigham Young in England, we have seen the largest gathering of Israel that the world has ever seen to this date, I believe.
To this date?
I believe it's to this date, the largest gathering of a body of people, right? They're gathered in one location, and it's Brigham Young's converts, and it's Israel being gathered home. This is like, we're missing the Exodus, that we're all waiting for this Exodus, or of gathering of Israel, and we've already seen the first one, and this is Brigham Young, right? His labors in the other apostles in England. Those converts they're Israel, they're coming home, they're being gathered, and they're being gathered to Nauvoo. And then when we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, why there's so much animosity against Brigham Young, and it's because of his success. It really is his success. He gathered Israel. The keys were given to Joseph Smith. He went out and did the work. Joseph Smith is given the keys, he's given the vision, delegates to Brigham Young. Brigham Young goes out and fulfills the mission, if that makes sense. And then just leading up to the succession crisis, I think it's significant to point out, because everyone thinks it was like, well, the church had to choose between Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon, right? And like, Sidney Rigdon was gypped. But most people, I am shocked, haven't heard this statement from Joseph Smith on August 13th of 1843. He actually sent out a, whatever you call it, a proclamation. I don't know, it wouldn't be a proclamation, but he sent out a notice to the saints, and he said, quote, "We've had certain traders in this city who have been writing falsehoods to Missouri. And there's a certain man in this city who has made a covenant to betray and give me up to the Missourians. And that too before Governor Carlin commits his persecutions. That man is no other than Sidney Rigdon." So not only did Joseph Smith, he publicly calls out Sidney Rigdon as a traitor, but then he withdrew his fellowship from him, and he asked the saints to proclaim it abroad that he would no longer accept him as his counselor. And this recorded in the history of the church. So, I mean, not only was Sidney Rigdon not like the rightful successor, but he was named by Joseph Smith as one of the traitors who betrayed him, and that Joseph Smith withdrew his fellowship. And then Jacob talked about how ensuring that the fullness of the priesthood would be preserved. And it's also significant that when Sidney Rigdon was rejected by the body of the saints, that he then made a false prophecy that not another stone will be laid on the temple. So you can see that Brigham Young is the one who's trying to carry on the work of Joseph Smith, and Sidney Rigdon is the one that's trying to tear it down.
Ooh, that's good.
Joseph wanted to drop him from the first presidency at the October 1843 conference.
Kimberly, thanks for sharing that, because I was unaware of Joseph's proclamation about Sidney Rigdon. That's interesting. Taylor, what would you have?
Yeah, so just a little bit more detail on that, those events. So I was not aware of this because, I had just heard the church accounts talking about, I thought it was a 2-horse race between, Sidney Rigdon versus Brigham Young. And I was, but going back to the Joseph Smith trying to release Sidney from the first presidency. So that happened, and the church they wouldn't sustain it. They voted it down. And Joseph, being the man of principle that he is, was like, okay, well, if common consent, that's a true principle. So he basically said, okay, if that's their choice, okay, we'll roll with that. But that didn't mean he was forced to not have no counselors, because it was his counselors in the first presidency at that time were Sidney Rigdon, who abandoned the church, was a traitor, and William Law, who also basically got Joseph killed with the novel expositor and all of that stuff. So Joseph called a third counselor, and he only had one, guy that he could rely on. It happens to be my ancestor, Amasa Mason Lyman. And Amasa Lyman was a real interesting figure because he's kind of been written out of church history. He stood up at that August 8th conference, and Sidney stood up for hours, and gave apparently some really verbose sermon about it. And Amasa Lyman stood up second, and he basically talked for 2 minutes and said, okay, so the reality is Brigham Young is the rightful heir. And this is actually backed up. This isn't just, family history, hearsay or whatever. This is backed up in the records because Amasa Lyman was present at a lot of these holy quorum, anointed quorum meetings. And when Joseph Smith was absent, Brigham Young presided, and that's in the records. And, that goes for the quorum of anointed and the council of 50 minutes. And so, but Amasa Lyman stood up for 2 minutes, and he just basically bore his testimony that before Joseph's death, he gave the keys of the kingdom to the 12 and Brigham as the president of that quorum. And so he just basically threw his support to Brigham. One of the other concerns, or I guess objections, that I've seen people make of this transfiguration, because of course, very few of these accounts were recorded contemporaneously. Most of them were recorded, decades after the fact, and that could call into question some of the reliability of some of these accounts of the transfiguration of Brigham Young. Nevertheless, there are some contemporaneously recorded, just like a few, I want to say weeks or months. I know, Jacob, you actually wrote a paper about this that I read a few years ago, and it basically talks about how it was not necessarily like a flash and like instantly hundreds of people heard Joseph Smith. It was more of an ongoing, like, it wasn't an event. It was an ongoing thing that people bore testimony to. And so I think that it's just really important to keep in mind that these types of accounts are, just because they weren't contemporaneously recorded necessarily doesn't mean that they're not valid, because there are some, and then people who were present at these meetings definitely recorded later on of the truth of what happened. So I just wanted to just throw in the importance of spiritual witnesses. It'd be one thing if Brigham Young was just told to, just took the reins and abused, I guess you could say, abused his position of authority. But that's not what happened. And he rather instead he was just, like it has been said, perpetuating the work that Joseph Smith commenced with the temple and so forth. So that's all I had.
No, that's good stuff. Something else that jumps out at me about this time period is that with enemies of Brigham, it's often portrayed that Brigham came in and seized power in this moment. I think it's worthwhile to point out that it's not like Brigham just set himself up as president of the church. The church operated under apostolic direction for a number of years, clear into the Utah period, before Brigham is named president of the church and then sustained as prophet, seer, and revelator. So this idea that Brigham just comes in and just seizes power, and this was his plan from the beginning, it doesn't hold water, right? And we can see that Brigham, true to the man he was, he counsels with those other members of the 12. Now, I want to be clear here. There's no doubt that the rest of the 12 deferred to Brigham, right? And I think that's because everybody understood who Brigham was, right? I don't get the sense that Brigham had to stand on authority, so so to speak, a great deal. Just who he was enough that people naturally wanted to follow him. Now, that transfiguration moment, that's a huge moment, right? Because it's a kind of a stamp and seal of approval from Joseph on Brigham, right? Is I think how a lot of people viewed this, and that it was very much this idea that Brigham would continue the work that Joseph had started. And so I think it's important, that context, especially because it's one that we find a lot, that Brigham's just power hungry and he's just waiting for his opportunity to pounce on that power. It couldn't be farther from the truth. All right, so Joseph's martyred. We have these events as Jacob put everything together. I want to now go to really one of the best revelations that in my opinion that Brigham ever gets, and that's section 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And this is one of those times that I think, because Brigham gets this, and what's amazing is that it sounds very much like the rest of the revelations that had been given previously, right? And so much like the Transfiguration event, this also is an event at which I think a lot of the other saints were able to say, look at that, the Lord's still speaking through this leadership. One of the things I find so interesting is how he's able to lay out how the camp is supposed to be governed, so to speak, right? In their Exodus West, how they're to do this. And he patterns it a lot after the Old Testament when he gets that revelation from the Lord. My question to you guys is this. Do you guys know, well, let me rephrase this. Not so much a question. I had somebody reach out to me once when we were talking about Brigham Young. I can't remember what episode it was, but somebody had got upset. This was a person who lived in Ireland, of all places. And I got just a scathing email blaming Brigham Young for more deaths on the trail than needed to happen. He was a horrible leader, and that's why a whole bunch of people died on the trail. This got me thinking real quick. And I was like, okay, I should probably go do some research. So I went ahead and I looked at the Mormon Trail versus the Oregon Trail. And the deaths that happened on the Mormon Trail were far less frequent than what was happening on the Oregon Trail. On the Oregon Trail, I believe the numbers were somewhere, and this is according to the government's own numbers, is that you're looking at about a 12% chance you're going to die on that trek west to the Oregon country. With Brigham Young's Mormon Trail, it's less than 1%. You got a 99 point something percent chance you're going to reach your destination alive. What is it about Brigham Young that you think people responded so well to on this trek west? both during the Vanguard Company as well as other people coming over. What does Brigham do that makes this so wildly successful?
I guess I'll dive in first. I think so. Of course, Joseph Smith had unparalleled gifts, and his ability to inspire and just obtain revelation and commune with heaven are just unequaled. Brigham didn't have those gifts. He was not the visionary, but I don't think Joseph Smith himself could have done the job that Brigham Young did as far as organizing and preparing every needful thing, like actually doing the revelation, what's outlined in, I think it's section 88. And it's he was just a master of organization and bringing people together, uniting around a common cause. Like, I don't know if we've ever seen, if the world's ever seen a guy more gifted and capable than Brigham Young of bringing people together to work toward a common goal. And so I think that, and I would even go as far as to say Joseph Smith is included in that number, and that doesn't take anything away from Joseph, but it's just foolishness in my mind to criticize Brigham Young's leadership when, like, the proof is in the pudding. By their fruits you shall know them. What you just cited, you know, over 12 times more deaths on the Pioneer Trail. I mean, yes, there were deaths, but to try to say that you know, Brigham has blood on his hands or something, I don't understand that. And I guess I'm just kind of shocked at the ignorance that somebody would have to have to even think that was like a historical number or claim or anything like that. So
I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
I think many of the things that are brought up against Brigham, like was just mentioned, that this person from Ireland, is that what you said?
Yeah.
How he has blood on his hands because of all these things that happened. I sometimes wonder if they've ever read their scriptures, because if you look at Lehi and his family, they're called out of Jerusalem, and they don't get called out and then all of a sudden they're in the promised land. They go through years of trials and tribulations, even to the extent that you have brothers, you know, threatening to kill their brother. And, you know, outsiders looking in can see this is kind of a dysfunctional family. But when you begin to read the lives of prophets throughout the Bible, Book of Mormon, you see that these kind of things happened because opposition exists. And I don't understand the way people view religion to say, well, they have to be completely free of any of that for me to ever believe them. Even any success story that you find in life, I doubt that you find them in a vacuum, free of any kind of trials or controversies that surround these people, because pretty much anything worthwhile is going to be met with opposition, and sometimes, like the Savior said, those who will oppose you the most come from your own house. And so I think that those arguments are really naive. There's this a man from Israel. His name is Joseph Ginat, and he was a minister in the a cabinet member of the Yitzhak Rabin administration, and he was giving a talk in Salt Lake. And he made the statement that in 1948, he was pretty young at the time. He was born in the 30s, early 30s. And he said they handed rifles to the women and children to defend themselves against the attacks coming in from the Arab neighbors. There was this lady that raised her hand and said, "Why would you make your women and children fight?" his answer was, there was 10 to 15 million Jews, and they were surrounded by 800 million Muslims. And he said we had to even up the odds to the best of our ability. Then she answered saying, couldn't you have made a treaty with your enemies so that they would respect your women and children? His answer was, our enemies vowed that they wouldn't stop until the Mediterranean Sea was red with Jewish blood, man, woman, and child. Does that answer your question? So the point I'm getting at is there is a naivete with people that have this view of life, and they seem to negate reality in their considerations. And this reality gives a ton of context to things that happen. So we can't just see isolated incidents and say, well, this guy was evil, this guy was good, or anything like that. You have to look at a broad spectrum of circumstances, attitudes, culture, all kinds of things to make a determination of what really happened. Anyway, that's it.
Thanks, Sean. Jacob, anything you want to add to that before we move on here?
So, yeah, I agree with everything Sean and Taylor said on that. I think, obviously there's trials and difficulties, and I think what you brought up is, compare it to the other treks and other trails going west. The Saints had a lot less difficulties comparatively. And I think that's actually kind of miraculous because they were not prepared in any real sense of the word for that exodus. They had, they labored and spent all their means to get that temple completed. I think people don't realize how incomplete the temple was when Joseph died. As far as I understand, they didn't even have the first story all the way completed. They had the walls of the first story, but they didn't have it. That's less than, that's very uncompleted, but they went and they finished it all the way up to the capstone and then finished up the interiors to the point they were able to do ordinances in there. And all the while they know that they're facing mob threats, and even the governor of Illinois is wanting to call in the he's trying to ask for federal assistance to drive the Mormons out of Nauvoo. And the president of the United States said, I can't be involved with with using U.S. troops to persecute a religious community out of a state. But so they as Brigham said, they had to complete the temple with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other, essentially. And they were able to, and they were basically getting robbed of their property. Their property was going to be worthless, and they had to sell it for hardly anything. And a lot of it actually didn't get sold for hardly anything, from what I understand. And so they were again being robbed of everything they had built and created again, just like they were in Missouri. And they tried to be as prepared as they could. I think that's one of Brigham Young's strengths as a leader, was that he was really great at organizing and really great at trying to unite their efforts to first complete the temple, and then secondly to start the exodus westward and to concentrate their efforts and their, not just spiritually, but their temporal efforts working together. And he said in the temple, they actually all made a pledge after the endowments that they would help all the poor who were in the church gather out west with them. So that would take an enormous sacrifice to not just those who had some means to be able to travel out west, but help everyone else who doesn't have means to travel out west. But Brigham really tried to prepare. And I think even in spite of his desire to prepare, he probably felt that they could have been a bit more successful. He might have had some unrealistic expectations, but what he was able to accomplish was really miraculous. And the initial pioneer party, as I understand it, they didn't have a single person die on the initial pioneer expedition. I think they had over 150 men, right, on the initial expedition to the Salt Lake Valley. and a couple women, and they were able to do that relatively safely. I think Brigham got, and some of the others did get sick at certain times, and Brigham was actually on his deathbed from whatever sickness he contracted, but he was fortunately able to recover. But I do think that there were others who kind of wanted to push things a little bit more. So on the second trek west, Brigham had given strict instructions that they needed to have like 3 years worth of provisions before coming out to Utah, and they need to try to make sure they have enough. They're taking along a certain number of the poor with them to fulfill their covenant in the temple. And what kind of happened was he set John Smith in charge of the second pioneer company out to Utah, while Brigham and the 12 led the first pioneer company. But John Taylor and Harley P. Pratt were a bit over. They kind of took over the second pioneer company. They kind of about, we need to have a certain number of years of provisions, just to make sure that everyone's safe. And they kind of got a bit overzealous, and they enlarged it to a lot more people than they had rather compared to their provisions. And so I think that somewhat contributed to some of the difficulty in the early years. But I do think that in spite of the difficulties, that it is nothing less than miraculous that they were as successful as they were. And I think that to try to blame the handcart, so the handcarts were actually relatively successful as well. There was only that one season where and it wasn't Brigham Young telling people to leave late in the season. It was other local church leaders that were involved with making the decision and it was to a degree with the Martin and Willie handcart companies. They kind of knew that they were taking risks with it, because there was actually one church leader who said, "Hey, I think it's wiser for us to winter," and he did convince some families not to go late in the season, but unfortunately most of the others went anyway. But they did it on their own kind of prerogative. And what one of the strengths of Brigham's character was that he really was able to what's the term for get all the saints. He really got the saints on their feet to immediately go and rescue those saints that were stranded out in the plane. Yeah, mobilized. He really mobilized the people to rescue those who encountered that tragedy. And if you discount that tragedy, which Brigham Young felt was unnecessary because his instructions had been never to leave late in the season. You don't want to risk being caught in the snow in Wyoming, without any supplies or anything. And so, I do think that Brigham really is great at mobilizing the saints to work together. I think that the Perpetual Immigration Fund that he set up was actually just an ingenious way to continue to facilitate the principle of the gathering that Joseph Smith taught was so important, was that they were able to get all the saints to continue to donate and support additional saints to be able to come out and gather. So I think that it's there's difficulties, but I think that's nothing short than miraculous that they had the success that they did.
Absolutely. Kimberly, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just have to add this really quickly. So just speaking of the Martin Handcart Company, there was 576 who began the trek, and it says at least 145 died. And I just have to read you this quote because it says that years later, several saints were conversing about the incident. Their criticisms of the leaders fell upon the ears of an elderly man who had been a member of the company. After listening for a while, he finally rose and said, "I ask you to stop the criticism. You are discussing a matter you know nothing about. Cold historical facts mean nothing here, for they give no proper interpretation of the questions involved. We suffered beyond anything you can imagine, and many died of exposure and starvation. But did you ever hear a survivor of that company utter a word of criticism? Not one of the company ever apostatized or left the church, because every one of us came through with the absolute knowledge that God lives, for we became acquainted with him in our extremities."
Wow. Brigham, in my opinion, does not get enough credit for getting the saints west. And not only does he not get enough credit for that, there's there's a moment within Nauvoo where Brigham is telling everyone, get ready, like Jacob had pointed out, get as much provisions as you can, 3 years worth, whatever it is, get ready to make that trip. But there's something else Brigham does while in Nauvoo in preparation to go across the plains into the Rocky Mountains that he does that I think gets overlooked. And that is, as soon as the temple's done, that thing's operating 24 hours a day, right? Brigham himself makes a journal entry that I was in the temple all night performing ordinances. Brigham understands how important those ordinances are. And he also understands that just like you need temporal preparations to get through this, the saints are going to need those temple blessings as well. I could only imagine what Brigham must have thought as he's getting ready to do this. He knows, right? Look, in our modern day society, by and large, unless you're caught in a horrible active shooter situation or whatever, we're not really exposed to massive death, right? Folks in Brigham's time, this was a very real thing. Not necessarily shootings, but just from privation, and from exposure, those sorts of things. Death is always there. So I imagine Brigham, looking out on that congregation of saints, understands they're going to need these blessings because some of them aren't going to make it to where we need to go. And he wanted the saints to be spiritually prepared as well as temporally, right? That they could, if someone was lost along the trail, it's not the end. And I think that's something that gets really overlooked. The other thing is that Brigham does something that is really quite extraordinary. And we have a lot of accounts of this where he actually talks about, as they circle the wagons for the night, they have dances, right? They spend time together, not just in working, but in forging bonds of friendship through those sorts of things. Brigham is masterful, not just at the nuts and bolts of, just getting people from point A to point B, but also keeping their spirits up along the way. There's accounts of him giving blessings on the trail as well. One lady in particular who had, I believe, a wagon had rolled over her leg, and she was suffering a lot. And Brigham tended to her in such a tender way. Going back to the Martin Willie Handcart Company, that was a horrible winter. Look, all winters are horrible in Wyoming. I've done enough surveying in that state to know that that's a rough place. But that winter was especially rough. Now, by the time Brigham finds out that these saints are in trouble on the plains, it's conference time. The weather's still pretty decent. But Brigham, there's something with Brigham where he knows something far worse is coming, more than just the average cold. And had Brigham not acted when he did, in that very moment, there's a sense of urgency. When Brigham says, we're stopping everything, we've got to go get these folks off the plains right now. And pardon me, I get a little choked up when I think about it, because he's really their only chance at that point. And people don't understand that without Brigham's decisive leadership at that moment, coupled with what, frankly, I believe is a prophetic mantle that fell upon him, especially in that moment, he gets an inkling of how bad this is going to be. And he acts with such decisiveness in that moment that they're able to go get him. Does anyone else have anything they want to add to this part before we move on? Okay.
Well, you could say he received a revelation, right?
Right.
I mean, people say Brigham Young didn't have any revelations, but he had revelations all the time. It's just not the kind of revelations they're hoping for. But when you receive a revelation to go out and save the saints, if you're that saint being saved, then you're thankful, that he's a prophet at that time receiving revelation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I just feel like he doesn't get enough run and enough recognition for how much he loved his people and how much he sacrificed personally for them. So we've been at this now 2 hours, and we could go on for probably another 6, just talking about all the cool stuff he did during the Utah period. But we're kind of wrapping up on time, and I quite frankly don't want to keep anyone up any longer than I have to. Does anyone want to speak on anything that they think's important before we move on talking about what Brigham's importance is to the restored gospel here? Okay.
I can share maybe a personal.
Okay.
So I was raised in the church, obviously. I've always kind of had a testimony and known the gospel was true and committed to the church and served a mission and all of that stuff, right? And and going back to something Kim brought out at the beginning, is that a lot of members are just not acquainted with the things that Brigham said and did. And I, as a history lover, and it's something my family always prioritized, and like I was probably one of the better informed members of the church, even at a young age, on a lot of those historical details. But Brigham, even then, he was a controversial figure. And because I had, before my mission, I was at college, and met some anti-Mormons, and they brought up the Adam God doctrine, and I was not acquainted with that. I mean, I'd heard vaguely, and I think I might have asked my seminary teacher once as a kid, "Hey, what's this? I heard there's this thing of Adam God," and he's like, "Oh, he was just, people claim that Brigham Young said stuff that he didn't actually say." And as a teenager, I accepted that. Well, I met these anti-Mormons, and they were showing me some quotes that looked like came from the Journal of Discourse. I was like, my grandma has those on her bookshelf. My grandpa had a set of those. That seems kind of official, and I tracked it down, and so I asked my institute teacher, "Hey, is this a thing? Like, it looks like he actually did say it wasn't taken out of, and Brigham and my institute teacher was trying to help me, prepare for my mission. You don't want to get your head out of the game at that stage." And so he was just like, "Yeah, but it was taken out of context. The anti-Mormons, they're not honest in the way they represent things." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, I get that." Well, I got home from my mission and met some more anti-Mormons, and I was just like, okay, so he did actually say these things. He wasn't taken out of context, because I actually read a lot more of the source material at that point. And I was just like, well, if it's true, like, for me, I didn't care if it was controversial. I cared if it was true. And I was doing a summer job down in Texas. I was reading, and I just decided to read the Discourses of Brigham Young. And there's so much just meat on that bone. Like, he talked about building up Zion, getting out of Babylon, establishing autonomy and self-reliance and preparedness, like all of these things that really resonated with me at that point in my life, especially as kind of like, getting ready for the apocalypse, doomsday prepper type, and it just, I was just on fire reading the Discourses of Brigham Young, and it got to the Adam God, and I just remember I got a testimony of Brigham Young. I mean, I always had kind of that testimony, and I had some powerful experiences witnessing personally to me of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's prophetic mission. I had not had the same experience with Brigham Young until that summer when I was reading those discourses, and it's the same spirit that I had a testimony of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and the rest of the Restoration. That same spirit testified to me that Brigham Young was a prophet of God. And so it took a little bit more digging and kind of working through some of these contradictions, because there are some prominent leaders of the modern church that claimed that it was a heresy to believe that Adam was God, and just various things like that. And I was like, what? I thought that and I thought that prophets couldn't say anything wrong, when they were acting as a prophet. And so it took me a little bit more time to kind of reconcile and work through some of those contradictions. But I could always fall back on that testimony that I got just plain reading the source documents, reading the Discourses of Brigham Young for myself. And it's just an undeniable spirit, to be honest. So I just wanted to I guess end with that.
No, that's good. Kimberly, what's Brigham Young's importance to the restored gospel?
Well, like I kind of said earlier, without Brigham Young, without Brigham Young, there's no temple, there's no temple ordinances, there's no sealing power. We don't have hardly any of the revelations of Joseph Smith. I mean, really, Brigham Young, I would say, is the restoration. Like I said before, Joseph Smith, he gets the vision, kind of like Lehi, right? Lehi gets the vision. Who carries on his work? Nephi. Joseph Smith is getting the vision. He's getting the revelations. Who's doing the work? It's President Brigham Young. He is the only one that carried on the work of the prophet Joseph Smith. And I think we all owe him, love him or hate him, we all owe him a debt of gratitude. And I'll just say one thing about Brigham Young. I relate very well to Brigham Young when we talked about like his early, like, you know, his early life and his challenges. And I'm different. I'm not, I wasn't raised in the typical LDS home where the gospel was handed to me. You know, I actually had to fight for it a lot. And so when I wanted to learn about what my religion was, you know, the gospel that I was baptized into, because I wasn't taught it in my home, I went to Brigham Young to learn the gospel, and that's who converted me to not only to Joseph Smith, but to Jesus Christ. And a lot of people talk about that we can't trust the historical record because they're you know, later reminiscences. And I just want to say that they're forgetting about the power of the Holy Ghost. The Holy Ghost has the power to bring all things to the remembrance, and this work is a spiritual work. And a lot of the experiences people had were spiritual, even if they didn't understand them at the time. And so when people are writing reminiscences, it's being brought to the remembrance by the power of the Holy Ghost. And so I believe our history is a prophetic history. It's written just as the scriptures are written by the Holy Ghost. And so it takes the Holy Ghost in order to understand our history and to appreciate Brigham Young for the modern day Moses that he is. And I have a lot more to say about him, but I'll just end there.
Fantastic. Thanks. Sean, you had something?
Yes. The one thing that I wanted to mention, and I think it can't be emphasized enough. When you look at the contending parties at the death of Joseph Smith, previous to the death of Joseph Smith and around his death, those contending parties, those who stayed behind, some went to other states and so forth. The vast majority of those, for all practical purposes, are defunct, because even though they may still exist, if you look at the character of what they preach, it hardly resembles anything of the Mormonism of Joseph Smith's time. You look at the Community of Christ, which used to be called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I watched this several videos from a historian from that organization, and he basically stated when they found out that Joseph indeed lived, that he indeed received a revelation, taught and lived plural marriage, they decided to start distancing themselves from Joseph Smith. And nowadays they look at the Book of Mormon as inspired fiction. I went through their temple that they have in Independence, and I went through their visitor center and everything. And you watch a short video, kind of like you do when you go through LDS visitor centers. And it was interesting. They're talking about the account of the first vision, but they said that Joseph Smith just had an experience with the divine, and that's how they left it. And I was thinking to myself, wow, this is dry. And it seems like they're completely ashamed of that whole history. And it's like Kimberly brought out, Brigham Young is very instrumental in preserving all that. And to those critics of Brigham Young about how he wanted to revise all the history and everything, why did he leave in all the entries where Joseph Smith is saying things that are can be perceived as being contrary to the principle? Those things weren't hidden from the record; they were there. And as far as reminiscences are concerned and everything, most of our lives are undocumented. Nevertheless, these things did happen. True, we can't prove things happened if there's no record, but you can't prove that it didn't happen either. And when you compare people's recollections, especially when you have such a vast variety, and you begin to connect the dots and see a lot of common denominators, you can establish with a great deal of confidence that certain events did take place. And so I, for one, I'm very grateful that Brigham Young did what he did and did what he had to do to preserve it. And so that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Sean. Jacob, go ahead, man.
Cool. Yeah, there's just, I have got I think the way you get a deep respect of Brigham Young is to earnestly study his words. That they are available, and it takes the time commitment to start to read his sermons, but there is so much light and truth in there that is why so many people have an unshakable testimony of Brigham Young as a prophet of God, in spite of all the railing accusations that could be made against him. That all the, it doesn't matter when you've got that testimony and you know what is in his heart from the Spirit bearing witness to you. I absolutely agree that, as was mentioned early in the presentation, that basically, over 95, maybe 99% of what Brigham Young taught doctrinally, you can show had its links to Joseph Smith in some way. I think that, so a lot of people will criticize blood atonement, when I think when it comes down to it, I think blood atonement was just a mixture of capital punishment and the violent Western rhetoric that could, those were what that was. And I think there's a great quote that kind of addresses the accusations of Brigham Young being a tyrant, and also the early Utah being a period of violence. And this is in Thomas Alexander's recent biography, Brigham Young and the Expansion of the Mormon Faith. He said, "All too often, critics of Brigham Young have assumed that he controlled the Latter-day Saints through fear, coercion, and violence. We should understand, however, that these methods can control a people only if they have no way of escaping the system. In Utah, most of those who wanted to leave the territory generally either did so, or they remained and fashioned their lives according to their own persuasion. Clearly, a few who wanted to leave could not do so because of violence. The Parish Potter murders are witness to that. Many of those who left Utah chose moderate Mormonism by joining with Emma Smith in the reorganization under her oldest son with Joseph Smith. Or like Wilford Woodruff's friend, Alexander Badlam, some moved to California to engage in business. Some businessmen like brothers Samuel, David, Joseph, and Matthew Walker and the Godbeites, an LDS offshoot of business people and intellectuals, remained in Utah to run businesses outside of the Mormon fold. Violence did exist in Utah, as historians Scott Thomas and Polly Arid have shown. Michael Quinn has argued that Utah harbored a, quote, culture of violence. Most of it, however, as Thomas's study has shown, was uncoordinated vigilante action or commonplace criminal activity. Available statistics show that Utah was less violent than other areas of the West. In fact, Brigham Young wanted apostates to leave the community so he could build saints. "You nasty apostates, clear out," he said. As Polly Arid has reminded us, she has given us case studies of 7 individuals who wanted to leave and succeeded without too much difficulty. All of them believed that violence existed in the community, but Arid cited only Swiss immigrants Frederick Loba, who made specific charges that are clearly questionable. In many cases, those who wanted to leave could not because they were too poor or they owed debts and they could not pay. At times, the creditors and debtors could not agree on the extent or even the existence of the debt. Such disagreements led to some cases of property confiscation by bishops, or in several instances, a demand by Brigham Young that the debtor pay what Young believed he owed before leaving. A more pertinent question is, why would the Mormon people persevere by traveling 1,000 miles to Utah and then disperse throughout the Mountain West, where they chose to live in relative poverty on hard scrabble farms, house their families in wagon boxes and dugouts, and dig irrigation ditches? They might have abandoned Mormonism and remained in the Midwest on prosperous farms blessed by summer rain. It seems ludicrous to believe that they did what they did because of coercion. Rather, they found in Mormonism and Brigham Young's teachings a philosophy and way of life that offered happiness in this life and the expectation of an exalted one after death and the resurrection. So I think that's a good quote that I think summarizes the contrast between the spurious allegations that can be made of, or criticisms, versus the reality of how things actually were in Utah. And I think that that's truly what it comes down to is, life is messy, and you can always find things to nitpick or criticize about different historical figures, and no one is perfect. But I think what's way more important is to find the truth and the light and the revelation and the knowledge that you can really glean from Brigham Young. And that's my testimony. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 As I look around the landscape of Mormonism right now, one of the things that concerns me most is how people are quick and somewhat eager to throw out Brigham Young. And that spans the gamut of Mormon expression, from the LDS Church on down to fundamentalists now. I want to make this as clear as I can. And I also want folks who are Protestants to know this isn't meant as a slam. But quite frankly, if we unhook Brigham Young from the Restoration, we don't have anything that resembles Mormonism as we've come to know it and as it was revealed by Joseph Smith, period. Joseph revealed a lot of things, and then Brigham went on to organize those things. By Joseph's commission, I might add, especially when we start talking about temple ordinances. Joseph's direct commission to Brigham Young was systematize and organize the endowment, which he did. It's under Brigham's administration that many of the things that we have come to hold dear as Mormons come to full fruition. Look, they were willing to kill Joseph just for saying the canon of Scripture is closed. Now, you start getting into the nature of God, you start getting into plural marriage, which upsets Victorian era sensibilities. Joseph didn't have the freedom that Brigham did to expound on these topics. And these topics would come to define the Mormonism that I think all five of us now enjoy to its utmost. When a loved one passes, as Mormons, we can look back on sealings and we understand the plan. That comes because Brigham Young held the line. When things were at their worst, the Lord and Joseph turned to Brigham, because in Brigham you had a guy who was just stubborn enough to keep those things going. You have a man who comes forward, who carves out a magnificent city in the desert out of rock and sagebrush right next to a great big salty lake that Bridger told him he would never turn a single crop in. And so for those who want to unhitch to Brigham Young, I would say be very careful. Understand what it is you stand to lose by throwing Brigham out of the Restoration. Because once you do, you've lost a lot of these things. You want to call D&C 132 Brigham's invention, which it's clearly not. That came from Joseph. But Brigham was the one who was able to expound on it. because he had the freedom to do so and the space to do so. What do you got left? You got Protestantism with some different buildings. And again, I'm not trying to slam Protestantism. I'm just saying that's what you have left. So you have to be very careful if you decide you want to throw Brigham Young out. The other thing I want to say, don't be afraid to teach your kids Brigham Young, right? So many times people turn away from Brigham because he says uncomfortable things. We have to wrestle with those. We have to make peace with those as adherents to the restoration. But never be afraid to teach your kids Brigham Young and teach the significance of Brigham Young. Nothing broke my heart quite like watching, and I'll just call it out, the LGBTQ protest at Brigham Young University, where they scrawl the name racist across Brigham's statue. We are dangerously close to throwing him out. And if it gets done, there will be hell to pay, quite literally, I fear, in the afterlife. We must preserve his legacy. It's worth preserving. Do your research on Brigham. I promise you he's not as scary as what others would point out. There's a lot of things about Brigham that are beautiful, that's a confirmation to his prophetic calling. And that's my testimony, and I leave it in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Yeah.
All right. Before we wrap up, does anyone have anything else they want to add?
There's a new movie actually coming out defending Brigham Young. I don't know if you're aware of the new movie that the Interpreter Foundation is
No.
releasing in October. So the new movie is 6 Days in August, about the succession crisis, and it's going to be in theaters on October 10th of this year. So you can look up that trailer online, and I'm really excited for that. It's from the so it's like a follow-up to the Witnesses movie. If you guys saw Witnesses, I actually still need to see that one. I'm bad for having a dozen people recommend it and haven't got around to seeing that one yet. So I need to watch that first, about the Book of Mormon witnesses, and then 6 Days in August is about Brigham Young's faithfulness in the succession crisis. So
Perfect. All right. Well, look, I love and respect each one of you. I'm a big fan of the work you do in defending the gospel, and I thank you so much for being on. So, all right. Bye, everybody.
Right.